The truck had always been there, resting along the curb like it belonged to the street itself. Sun-faded paint catching the early morning light, tires aligned carefully with the concrete edge. Nothing loud, nothing reckless, nothing that suggested rebellion or defiance, just a working vehicle parked where it had been parked hundreds of times before, on a road that looked and felt as public as any other road in the city, with mailboxes lining the edges, children's bikes leaning against fences. Trash bins rolling out every Thursday like clockwork, and the slow, predictable hum of daily life passing through it without question. That morning began no differently, until the small white slip tucked under the windshield wiper quietly introduced a conflict that would unravel an entire power structure piece by piece. The notice was printed, official-looking, heavy with authority, stamped with the HOA's logo as if that alone made it law, and it declared a violation with confident certainty. Illegal parking on private roadway, fine assessed, payment due immediately. At first, it felt almost humorous, the kind of mistake that happens when paperwork outruns reality, because the road had never once been described as private in any real sense, not when it was paved, not when streetlights were installed, not when city workers marked curbs or repaired storm drains. Still, the ticket sat there, undeniable, as if reality itself had shifted overnight. It was easy to dismiss it at first, to assume someone on the HOA board had confused addresses or boundaries, because this neighborhood had a long history of petty enforcement attempts that usually collapsed under basic scrutiny. But something about this notice felt different, heavier, more deliberate, like the opening move in a longer game. Over the following days, the truck remained where it was, not out of stubbornness but out of routine, and each morning brought another ticket, each one more assertive than the last, escalating language replacing explanation, penalties stacking with casual cruelty. And soon the total climbed into numbers that stopped feeling theoretical and began to feel threatening. $8,000 appeared on a statement that arrived without apology, as if the sum had always been owed, as if the road had always been theirs, as if the truck's presence was some outrageous intrusion rather than a familiar fixture. The HOA's tone grew colder, more legal, leaning hard on phrases like authority, compliance, enforcement, words chosen not to clarify but to intimidate, and the sense of humor evaporated completely. What made it worse was the confidence behind it all, the assumption that no one would challenge them, that the mere suggestion of fines and liens would silence any resistance before it formed. Neighbors began whispering, not loudly, not publicly, but in passing glances and lowered voices, because everyone had seen this pattern before. The way enforcement often started with one homeowner as a test, a signal to the rest of the street that resistance came with consequences. Some avoided eye contact, others offered sympathetic nods, and a few quietly admitted they had received similar warnings in the past but had paid them quickly just to make the problem disappear. The road itself became a strange symbol overnight, no longer just asphalt and paint, but a contested line between authority and assumption, between what was claimed and what was true. The HOA doubled down, issuing formal letters printed on thicker paper, citing covenants no one remembered signing, boundaries no one had ever seen mapped, and rules that seemed to expand every time they were questioned. Each letter carried the same underlying message. Compliance was expected, payment was overdue, and resistance would only make things worse. It would have been easy to give in, to move the truck, to pay the fine, to accept the inconvenience as the cost of living under an HOA that had slowly learned to confuse governance with control. But the more the pressure increased, the more the story stopped making sense. Streets don't become private by declaration alone, and ownership doesn't materialize just because someone insists on it loudly enough. That quiet doubt grew into something more solid, something that refused to be ignored, especially as the HOA began threatening liens, towing, and legal action, all based on the same unproven claim. The absurdity of it all became impossible to miss, because every visible sign contradicted the narrative they were pushing, from the city-installed signage to the public maintenance crews that serviced the area regularly without HOA involvement. The road had a name recognized by the city, appeared on navigation systems, and connected seamlessly to other unquestionably public streets, yet the HOA insisted it was theirs, as if repetition alone could overwrite reality. Each new ticket felt less like enforcement and more like provocation, daring someone to finally say no. And as the stack of notices grew thicker, so did the resolve to understand exactly where this claim had come from, because somewhere beneath the paperwork and posturing, There had to be a line on a map, a document, a single piece of evidence that either proved the HOA right or exposed the entire enforcement campaign as a fiction built on intimidation. The moment that question took hold, the story shifted from annoyance to investigation, from frustration to focus, because the truth about that road mattered not just for one truck, but for every homeowner who had quietly paid fines out of fear, assuming the HOA's authority was absolute. What began as a single ticket had now become a challenge to the foundation of that authority itself. And although no one on the street could yet see where it would lead, the tension in the air made one thing clear. This was no longer about parking, it was about power, and power, when questioned, rarely retreats quietly. The more the notices arrived, the more the situation demanded something beyond irritation, because irritation fades, but paperwork accumulates, and the HOA clearly understood that weight better than anyone else. Each envelope carried an unspoken confidence that most people would never push past the surface, that they would see official formatting and threatening totals and quietly surrender. Instead of paying, instead of moving the truck, the focus shifted inward, toward understanding how something so ordinary could suddenly be labeled illegal with such certainty. The first step wasn't dramatic or confrontational. It was quiet, methodical, almost boring in its simplicity, the kind of work that rarely makes it into stories but always determines how they end. Old closing documents were pulled from folders that hadn't been opened in years, pages yellowed slightly at the edges, signatures frozen in time from a moment when the house was just a purchase and not a battlefield. The deed was there, dense with legal language, describing boundaries with precision that felt oddly comforting, because deeds don't speak in assumptions. They speak in measurements and references, and nowhere in those pages was there any mention of a private road or HOA ownership of the street. That absence was subtle but important, like a missing brick in a wall someone claimed was solid. The HOA's letters, by contrast, were heavy on assertion and light on proof, repeating the phrase private roadway as if repetition alone could make it real. That contrast alone suggested something was wrong. The next step was the HOA's governing documents, the bylaws and covenants that were always described as ironclad but rarely read closely by anyone until there was a problem. Those documents, too, were full of rules about paint colors, fences, landscaping, and vehicle visibility. But when it came to street ownership, the language grew vague, referring to association-maintained areas without ever clearly defining where those areas began or ended. The street was mentioned only indirectly, as part of the neighborhood's layout, not as a possession. It was the kind of ambiguity that worked in the HOA's favor when no one questioned it, but collapsed the moment someone did. As the hours passed and the documents piled up on the table, a pattern began to emerge, one that suggested the HOA's authority had been quietly stretched over time, not through legal transfer, but through habit and assumption. Maintenance had always been handled by the city, not the HOA, from resurfacing to drainage, and yet the HOA spoke as if that history didn't exist. That disconnect made the next step obvious. Cities keep records, and those records don't care about neighborhood politics. They care about maps. The idea of a zoning map seemed almost laughably simple compared to the complexity of the threat being made, but simplicity has a way of cutting through noise, and if the street was public, there would be a line somewhere that proved it. The city's website was a maze of links and departments, designed more for bureaucracy than clarity, but persistence has its own momentum, and eventually the right section appeared, offering access to zoning and right-of-way information. The first map loaded slowly, layers of color and lines overlapping in ways that were hard to interpret at first glance. But as the legend became clearer, so did the story it was telling. Streets marked as public had a specific designation, a uniformity that stood out once you knew what to look for, and the road in question was shaded exactly the same way as every other unquestionably public street nearby. It connected to city infrastructure seamlessly, with no breaks, no transitions, no special markings that suggested private ownership. That single visual contradicted months of HOA enforcement in an instant, but one map alone wasn't enough, because authority thrives on technicalities. Another map was opened, this one older, archived from years back, and it told the same story as did another after that, stretching back to when the neighborhood was first developed. At no point did the street change status, shift ownership, or fall under private control. It had always been what it looked like, a public road maintained by the city, funded by taxes, and governed by municipal code, not HOA whims. That realization didn't bring relief so much as a strange sense of disbelief, because it meant the HOA hadn't just been mistaken, They had been wrong in a way that was easily verifiable, which raised an uncomfortable question about why they had been so confident. Confidence like that doesn't usually come from ignorance alone. It comes from experience getting away with it. The fines suddenly looked less like enforcement and more like a test of how far that confidence could go before someone pushed back. The next step was printing everything, because digital certainty has a way of feeling fragile until it's on paper. The maps, the legends, the zoning descriptions all stacked neatly, forming a counterweight to the HOA's letters. The contrast between them was stark. One side built on threats and assumptions, the other on data and documented fact. Still, there was no illusion that presenting this information would immediately end the conflict, because organizations that rely on authority rarely surrender it just because they're proven wrong. They escalate, shift arguments, search for loopholes, and double down on intimidation, hoping exhaustion will succeed where logic failed. That reality made preparation essential, because this wasn't just about erasing fines anymore, it was about exposing a claim that had no legal foundation. As word quietly spread among neighbors that the street might not belong to the HOA at all, reactions ranged from cautious curiosity to open disbelief, because many had accepted the HOA's version of reality for so long that imagining an alternative felt dangerous. Some worried that challenging the board would invite retaliation. Others wondered how many fines they had paid over the years without ever asking the obvious question. That unspoken anxiety lingered in every interaction, a reminder that power doesn't need to be legitimate to be effective, it only needs to be unchallenged. With the maps printed and the documents organized, the path forward became clearer, even if it promised resistance. The evidence existed, tangible and undeniable, and once something like that is seen, it can't be unseen. The street hadn't changed, the truck hadn't moved, but the story had shifted from accusation to accountability, and the next step would test whether the HOA's authority was real or merely performed. As the papers were gathered and set aside, there was no sense of victory yet, only anticipation, because presenting the truth is one thing, but forcing those who benefit from ignoring it to acknowledge it is something else entirely, and that confrontation was no longer avoidable. Armed with maps, records, and a growing certainty that the HOA's claim had no legal foundation, the situation moved from quiet research into open defiance, even without a formal meeting or raised voices. Because sometimes confrontation doesn't begin in a room, it begins the moment someone refuses to accept a lie as reality. The next letter sent to the HOA wasn't emotional or defensive. It was precise, deliberate, and structured to do one thing only: place documented fact directly against asserted authority. The printed zoning maps were attached, clearly labeled, along with excerpts from municipal code describing public rights-of-way, all presented without commentary, as if the evidence itself should be enough to speak. There was no accusation, no threat, just a simple request for clarification on how a public street, as defined by the city, had suddenly become a private roadway under HOA control. That silence, that refusal to argue emotionally, was its own form of pressure because it shifted the burden back where it belonged. The response, when it came, was slower than usual, and that delay alone suggested internal scrambling, the kind that happens when confidence meets contradiction. When the HOA finally replied, the tone had changed subtly, the sharp certainty dulled by legal phrasing and cautious language, acknowledging receipt of the materials without directly addressing them, and restating the violation as if repetition could substitute for explanation. It was a classic maneuver, sidestepping the evidence while hoping persistence would wear down resistance. The fines remained, the threats remained, but something important had cracked, because the response avoided the word private altogether, replacing it with vague references to association-controlled access, a phrase that meant nothing in legal terms but sounded authoritative enough to intimidate someone unfamiliar with the difference. That shift didn't go unnoticed, because it signaled that the original claim could no longer be defended directly. The truck stayed exactly where it was, not as a statement, but as a constant reminder that compliance wasn't automatic anymore. More tickets appeared, but they felt different now, less like enforcement and more like noise, attempts to maintain momentum in a narrative that was already unraveling. Neighbors watched quietly because the absence of immediate consequences challenged years of conditioning, the belief that defying the HOA always led to swift punishment. The street itself became a kind of stage, every parked car a silent participant in a test of boundaries that had never been tested before. Behind the scenes, the research deepened. because one map, no matter how clear, could always be dismissed as incomplete by someone determined to ignore it. The city's planning department became the next stop, not through confrontation but through inquiry, asking simple questions that required simple answers, the kind that bureaucracies are designed to provide. Emails went out, polite and neutral, asking whether the street in question was part of the city's public road network and whether any record existed of ownership transfer to a private entity. The responses arrived slowly but consistently, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. The street was public, had always been public, and remained under municipal jurisdiction. There was no record of any transfer, no agreement granting an HOA enforcement rights over parking, no special designation that would justify private control. Those confirmations were printed as well, stacked alongside the maps, building a body of evidence that was no longer just visual but institutional. The more official the confirmations became, the more fragile the HOA's position looked, because authority borrowed from assumption collapses the moment real authority speaks. Still, the HOA pressed forward, escalating language in their notices, threatening towing and legal action, even as their own wording grew increasingly cautious, as if they were trying to frighten compliance out of existence before the truth spread too far. That tension reached a strange peak, where both sides were acting as if the next move would define the outcome, yet neither had formally acknowledged the other's position. It was confrontation by correspondence, a battle fought through envelopes and emails rather than rooms and voices. Neighbors began to ask questions more openly now, not in whispers but in full conversations, because curiosity is contagious, and once the idea that the HOA might be wrong took hold, it spread faster than fear. Stories emerged, quiet admissions of past fines paid without understanding, of warnings issued for things that had never felt quite right, but it seemed easier to accept than to challenge. The street's history began to look different through that lens, less like a community governed by rules and more like one managed through habit and intimidation. That collective unease mattered because power structures rely on isolation, on making each conflict feel individual and small, but once patterns emerge, they become harder to dismiss. The HOA's silence on the evidence grew louder with each passing day because they still hadn't answered the simplest question: how could a public street be private? Instead, they issued a notice of intent to escalate enforcement, a formal step that suggested legal action was being considered, even as their foundation crumbled. That move felt less like confidence and more like desperation, an attempt to force resolution on their terms before the truth could be formalized. The choice now was whether to wait and react, or to push the issue into a space where assumption couldn't survive. The evidence was ready, organized, verified, and supported by the very institution the HOA claimed to outrank. The next step would no longer be quiet or indirect, because silence had done its work, and the absence of a real answer had become the answer itself. As the papers were gathered again, thicker now with confirmations and codes, the realization settled in that this was no longer just about ending fines or defending a truck's parking spot. It was about exposing a claim that had governed behavior for years without ever being proven, and the only way to end that kind of authority was to force it into the light, where it could no longer hide behind confident language and unchallenged assumption. The stage was set, not for an argument, but for a reckoning, and the next chapter would move the conflict out of letters and into a space where facts carried consequences, not just weight. The shift from a private dispute to a public matter didn't happen with a dramatic announcement or a sudden confrontation. It happened quietly, the way most irreversible changes do, when information crossed an invisible boundary and landed in the hands of someone who wasn't invested in preserving a false narrative. The city confirmation emails, once printed and stacked, felt different from the HOA's notices in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to ignore, because they carried a weight that didn't rely on tone or threat, only on record. With those confirmations in hand, the next move was no longer about arguing with the HOA at all. It was about letting reality speak in a forum where assumption held no value. A formal inquiry was submitted to the city's code enforcement and planning departments, not as a complaint, but as a request for clarification regarding ongoing private enforcement actions on a public right-of-way. The language was careful, neutral, almost understated, because the goal wasn't to inflame, but to document, to place the HOA's actions on record alongside the city's own definitions. That submission alone changed the dynamic, because once a city opens a file, It doesn't close it based on feelings or neighborhood politics. The response took time, measured in days that felt longer than they should have, because waiting without knowing how an institution will react is its own kind of pressure. During that time, the HOA continued issuing tickets, perhaps unaware that their actions were now being observed through a different lens, or perhaps aware, and hoping momentum would carry them through before scrutiny hardened into consequence. Each new notice felt increasingly hollow, like an echo of authority that hadn't yet realized it was fading. When the city finally responded, the language was direct and unmistakable, stating that the street in question was classified as a public roadway, maintained by the municipality, and not subject to private parking enforcement by an HOA. That single statement, stripped of drama, effectively dismantled the foundation of every fine issued to date. But cities don't stop at statements when records contradict behavior. They investigate processes, and that investigation expanded quickly, asking how long the HOA had been enforcing parking restrictions on a public street, under what authority, and whether residents had been fined or towed as a result. Those questions didn't accuse, they documented, but documentation has a way of revealing patterns that no accusation ever could. The HOA was notified of the inquiry, not as a warning, but as a procedural courtesy, and that notification marked the first time their authority was formally questioned by an entity that didn't rely on them for approval or cooperation. The tone of the HOA's communication shifted again, this time noticeably, growing restrained and carefully worded, as if every sentence was now being reviewed by someone who understood the consequences of admitting too much. Tickets stopped appearing on the truck's windshield almost immediately, not officially withdrawn, not apologized for, just quietly discontinued, as if their absence might go unnoticed or be interpreted as coincidence. Neighbors noticed anyway, because absence is often louder than presence, especially when everyone has been conditioned to expect enforcement as the default. Conversations changed tone, less fearful, more analytical, because once the city's involvement became known, the idea that the HOA's power might be limited stopped feeling like speculation and started feeling like inevitability. Requests for information spread through the neighborhood, residents asking how long fines had been issued, what authority had been cited, whether refunds were possible, and those questions created pressure the HOA couldn't control, because they came from within the community rather than from a single homeowner. The city followed up with requests of its own, asking for copies of the HOA's governing documents, enforcement policies, and any agreements that might grant them authority over the street. Those requests didn't accuse, but they implied scrutiny, and scrutiny is something power structures built on assumption rarely survive. Days passed without response, then weeks, and the silence from the HOA grew more conspicuous than their earlier confidence. When they did respond, the materials they provided were thin, generic, and carefully curated, offering no clear authorization for parking enforcement. No deed transfer, no municipal agreement, only internal rules written as if repetition could transform them into law. The city's reply was brief and procedural, stating that internal association rules did not supersede municipal jurisdiction over public roadways, and that any enforcement actions taken without authority could expose the association to liability. That word, liability, changed everything, because it reframed the situation from a dispute over rules into a question of accountability. The HOA's behavior stopped being annoying and started being risky, not just for one homeowner, but for the board members themselves. The fines that once felt threatening now looked fragile, like evidence of overreach rather than compliance. The city requested a list of all citations issued on that street over the past several years, and that request landed like a quiet thunderclap, because it suggested the scope of the issue was larger than anyone had admitted. Neighbors who had paid fines years earlier suddenly realized they might have been penalized without legal basis, and that realization spread faster than any formal notice ever could. The HOA attempted to reassure residents through a vague newsletter that emphasized community harmony and mutual respect, avoiding any mention of the investigation or the street's status, but the absence of specifics only deepened suspicion. Trust, once broken, doesn't repair itself through generic language. The truck remained parked, unchanged, almost symbolic now, not because it mattered where it sat, but because it marked the point where authority had been questioned and survived the challenge. The city's involvement introduced a new timeline, one governed by procedure rather than intimidation, and that shift made patience possible, because outcomes rooted in record tend to be permanent. As the investigation continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about a single road or a single HOA, but about how easily authority can expand when no one demands proof, and how quickly it contracts when proof is finally required. The story had moved beyond fines and tickets into a broader reckoning with how power operates in everyday spaces, and the next chapter would reveal just how fragile that power becomes when the structures that support it are exposed to light they were never designed to withstand. Once the city's questions began circulating, the HOA's authority didn't shatter all at once. It thinned, stretched, and weakened in visible ways, like a structure revealed to be hollow the moment pressure was applied from the outside. The board that had once communicated with sharp deadlines and confident threats now moved cautiously, their messages delayed, revised, and stripped of certainty, as if every word carried the risk of becoming evidence rather than instruction. What had once been framed as routine enforcement quietly transformed into an administrative inconvenience, then into a misunderstanding, and finally into something they avoided addressing directly at all. The fines that had totaled thousands of dollars were no longer mentioned by amount, only by vague reference, and the word illegal disappeared entirely from their language, replaced by softer terms that implied confusion rather than wrongdoing. That change wasn't accidental. It was strategic, an attempt to retreat without admitting error, because admission would invite consequences far beyond refunded tickets. The city's request for historical enforcement records created a tension that spread through the neighborhood in ways that couldn't be managed by newsletters or carefully worded updates. Residents who had once kept quiet now compared stories, dates, amounts, and letters, discovering that the same justification had been used repeatedly over the years, applied to different vehicles, different homeowners, always with the same confident claim of private control over a road that had never belonged to the HOA. What felt isolated before now looked systematic, and that realization reshaped how people viewed the board's past actions, reframing them not as strict management, but as unchecked overreach. The HOA attempted to slow the process by claiming incomplete archives, lost records, and changes in leadership, explanations that might have worked internally but sounded hollow when placed against the city's precise timelines and documented maintenance history. Each excuse only highlighted how little formal authority had ever existed beneath the enforcement, because legitimate power leaves a paper trail that doesn't vanish conveniently when questioned. The city's follow-up made that clear, noting discrepancies between the HOA's claims and municipal records, and requesting clarification on how enforcement had been justified without jurisdiction. That question, unanswered, became the center of the story because there was no clarification that could reconcile those facts. Meanwhile, the absence of new tickets spoke volumes, because enforcement that stops without explanation is rarely stopped by choice. Neighbors noticed that cars were now parked freely along the street without consequence, something that would have triggered warnings or fines just weeks earlier, and that visible shift reinforced what the paperwork already suggested. The HOA no longer believed its own claims strongly enough to act on them. The board's meetings grew quieter, less attended, and more defensive, with agendas that avoided enforcement topics entirely, focusing instead on landscaping and community events, as if redirecting attention could undo what had already been revealed. But attention, once redirected by truth, doesn't return easily. The city's investigation reached a point where formal conclusions were inevitable, and those conclusions didn't need drama to be devastating, because they were built on record rather than rhetoric. The street's status as a public roadway was reaffirmed officially, not as a clarification but as a correction, and that correction carried implications that extended beyond parking fines into the legitimacy of the board's past decisions. The illusion that the HOA's authority was absolute, unquestionable, and comprehensive had depended on silence and assumption, and now both were gone. Residents began asking not just about parking fines, but about other rules enforced aggressively over the years, wondering where else assumption had been mistaken for law. That curiosity unsettled the board more than any formal reprimand could have, because it challenged the foundation of compliance itself. Authority that relies on habit collapses the moment habit is questioned, and once that collapse begins, it doesn't stop at a single issue. The truck, still parked where it had always been, became a quiet marker of that shift, no longer the target of enforcement, but a reminder of how easily a challenge had unraveled something that once felt immovable. As the HOA scrambled to contain the fallout, it became clear that the real damage wasn't financial or procedural, but reputational, because trust, once eroded by overreach, doesn't regenerate through silence or avoidance. The story had moved beyond proving the street's status into exposing a pattern of authority exercised without verification, and that exposure changed how every rule, every notice, and every decision would be viewed going forward. The next chapter would push the consequences of that exposure further, because when an illusion collapses publicly, it doesn't simply disappear. It leaves behind questions, responsibilities, and a reckoning that no amount of careful wording can prevent. As the illusion of unquestioned authority continued to dissolve, the conversation shifted from whether the HOA had been wrong to what that wrongness meant in practical terms, because mistakes can be forgiven, but sustained overreach invites accountability. The city's review moved into a more formal phase, one focused not on classification but on consequence, examining how enforcement actions had been carried out, how fines had been collected, and whether residents had been penalized under claims that had no legal basis. That shift mattered, because it reframed the HOA's behavior from a misunderstanding into a record of actions taken without jurisdiction, and records, unlike narratives, don't soften under reinterpretation. Requests for restitution began circulating quietly among homeowners, not as demands at first, but as questions, people asking whether the fines they had paid over the years were valid, whether refunds were possible, and who would be responsible if they were. Those questions carried weight because they multiplied, and each one required an answer the board wasn't prepared to give. The HOA's attempts to respond became increasingly cautious, acknowledging confusion without admitting fault, offering to review individual cases while avoiding any statement that suggested systemic error. That piecemeal approach only highlighted the scale of the issue, because it treated a pattern as a series of isolated incidents, a strategy that rarely holds when documentation exists to connect them. The city's findings, while measured in tone, left little room for ambiguity, stating that private enforcement on public roadways was unauthorized and that fines issued under such enforcement were subject to challenge. That statement didn't order refunds directly, but it opened the door wide enough that walking through it felt inevitable. Neighbors who had once paid quietly now compared totals, discovering that the amounts varied but the justification did not, and that consistency made the overreach impossible to dismiss as accidental. The HOA's board meetings, once routine and sparsely attended, suddenly became crowded, not with confrontation but with expectation, residents sitting quietly, listening closely, waiting for clarity that never quite arrived. Each unanswered question deepened the sense that accountability was approaching from a direction the board couldn't control. The city requested corrective measures, asking how the HOA intended to prevent unauthorized enforcement in the future, and that question forced the board to confront the limits of its power publicly, something it had never had to do before. The answer, when it came, was carefully worded and defensive, emphasizing cooperation while avoiding specifics, a response that satisfied no one because it addressed tone rather than substance. The fines that had once loomed as threats now appeared as liabilities, and that inversion changed everything, because authority that exposes its holders to risk loses its intimidation factor almost instantly. Residents began to speak more openly about other grievances, not because they were newly angry, but because the fear that had kept those grievances private had weakened. The truck, still parked without consequence, had become irrelevant as an object and significant as a symbol, representing the moment when enforcement failed to materialize despite confident warnings. That absence of action mattered more than any formal statement, because it demonstrated in real time that the HOA's power had limits it had never acknowledged. The board attempted to regain control through process, proposing committees and reviews, hoping structure could replace certainty, but structure without legitimacy feels empty, and residents sense that. The city's involvement continued quietly, methodically, asking follow-up questions that required documented answers, not interpretations, and those questions accumulated, creating pressure not through confrontation but through inevitability. Accountability, once introduced, rarely retreats, because it doesn't rely on emotion or volume, only on consistency. The HOA's reluctance to address the full scope of the issue only ensured that others would, whether through formal complaints, legal inquiries, or collective action. The story had reached a point where resolution could no longer be delayed indefinitely, because unresolved accountability doesn't fade, it compounds. As residents left meetings with more questions than answers, it became clear that the next phase would involve not just acknowledgement, but change. And that change would test whether the board could adapt to a reality where authority required proof rather than assumption. The foundation that had supported years of unchallenged enforcement was gone, replaced by scrutiny and expectation. And the next chapter would reveal whether that foundation could be rebuilt honestly, or whether it would collapse entirely under the weight of its own history. What finally shifted the balance wasn't a letter, a map, or even the city's measured conclusions. It was the quiet, collective realization among the homeowners that the story they had been living under for years no longer made sense. And once that realization spread, it moved faster than any official notice ever could. People who had once avoided involvement began talking openly, comparing experiences not with anger at first, but with curiosity, because curiosity feels safer than confrontation, and yet it leads to the same place. Patterns emerged in those conversations, not just about parking fines, but about how enforcement had always seemed to favor pressure over explanation, how rules appeared without warning, how appeals were discouraged through delay and silence. The HOA's authority, once accepted as a given, started to look less like governance and more like habit, a routine everyone had followed because no one had ever been shown a reason not to. That shift in perception mattered more than any procedural finding, because authority lives or dies on belief, and belief was draining away in real time. The board sensed it, even if they didn't acknowledge it publicly, because their communications grew increasingly careful, less declarative and more conciliatory, as if tone alone could repair what transparency had broken. Attempts were made to redirect attention toward community projects and future plans, but those efforts landed awkwardly because the past had not been addressed, and unresolved pasts don't disappear simply because something new is offered. Attendance at meetings continued to rise, not with shouting or chaos, but with presence, rows of neighbors sitting quietly, listening intently, and waiting for answers that never quite arrived. That silence from the board, once interpreted as authority, now felt evasive, and the contrast was impossible to miss. The city's findings circulated informally through shared documents and conversations, and even those who hadn't been directly affected by fines began to understand the implications, because the issue was no longer about money or parking. It was about whether the rules everyone lived under were legitimate. That question has a way of reaching beyond the original conflict, touching every decision that relies on the same structure of power. The truck remained parked, unchanged and unremarkable, but its continued presence without consequence had become a daily reminder that enforcement was no longer automatic, that rules could be questioned and survive the challenge. That realization emboldened others, not into rebellion, but into inquiry, people asking for citations, references, and explanations they had never asked for before. Each question, polite and reasonable on its own, accumulated into a pressure the board had never faced, because it couldn't be dismissed as defiance or hostility. It was simply accountability. The board attempted to regain footing by proposing internal reviews and policy updates, but those proposals were met with skepticism, because internal solutions to external overreach rarely satisfy those who have already seen the limits of authority exposed. Trust, once eroded, demands more than promises to return. The city's ongoing oversight, though quiet, remained present, and that presence mattered, because it meant the HOA's actions were no longer contained within the neighborhood's social dynamics. They were part of a record. Neighbors who had once felt isolated in their frustrations now recognized a shared experience, and that recognition transformed individual grievances into collective awareness. The tone of the community shifted accordingly, less deferential, more analytical, as people began evaluating rules not by habit, but by justification. That shift unsettled the board more than open opposition ever could, because it removed the emotional leverage they had relied on for years. Fear had been replaced by understanding, and understanding is far harder to control. The illusion that questioning authority would lead to immediate consequences had been broken, not through confrontation, but through inaction, through the visible absence of punishment where punishment had been promised. That absence reshaped behavior subtly but permanently. Conversations that once ended with resignation now ended with resolve, not necessarily to dismantle the HOA, but to redefine its role in a way that aligned with reality rather than assumption. The board, faced with a community that no longer accepted assertions at face value, began to fracture internally, disagreements emerging over how to respond, whether to admit error, whether to continue deflecting, whether to protect the institution or acknowledge the harm done in its name. Those internal tensions leaked outward, visible in delayed responses and inconsistent messaging, further weakening the image of unified authority. The story had reached a point where momentum belonged not to any individual, but to the collective awareness of the neighborhood, an awareness that couldn't be reversed once established. The power dynamic had changed fundamentally, not because anyone had seized control, but because control had been revealed as conditional all along. As residents left meetings with a clearer sense of their own position, it became evident that the next phase would not be driven by the board's choices alone, but by the community's expectations, and those expectations now included transparency, legitimacy, and accountability. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with a sense of inevitability, because once a crowd turns from passive acceptance to active understanding, the structures that once governed them must either transform or fall, and the HOA was standing at the edge of that decision, whether it recognized it yet or not. The moment that finally stripped the HOA of any remaining illusion of authority didn't arrive with anger or spectacle. It arrived with a document so ordinary, so neutral, that it was almost anticlimactic. A city zoning map displayed during a routine municipal review, projected onto a screen with no dramatic emphasis, no raised voices, no need for interpretation, because the lines spoke for themselves. The street that had been the center of months of tension appeared clearly marked as a public right-of-way, its boundaries precise, its classification unmistakable, connected seamlessly to the surrounding road network in a way that left no room for narrative manipulation. There was no footnote, no exception, no conditional language that could be twisted into authority, just a clean designation that matched every record uncovered so far. That map didn't argue, it concluded, and in doing so, it rendered every prior enforcement action indefensible. The city's officials treated it as routine, because to them it was another confirmation of a status that had never been in doubt. But to the HOA, it was devastating, because it collapsed the last refuge of ambiguity they had relied on. The board could no longer claim confusion or inherited misunderstanding, because the map had existed long before any current member took a seat, and its clarity made the years of enforcement look less like oversight and more like presumption. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, not through announcements but through screenshots, shared links, and quiet explanations passed from one homeowner to another, each repetition reinforcing the same conclusion. The street had never belonged to the HOA, not in spirit, not in practice, and not on paper. The fines that had once felt threatening now looked absurd, artifacts of a claim that couldn't survive even casual scrutiny. The board's response to the map was careful to the point of paralysis. Statements delayed, drafts revised, meetings postponed, because acknowledging it openly meant confronting consequences that extended beyond parking. The city, however, moved forward without hesitation, updating records, closing inquiries, and documenting the outcome in a way that would outlast any board membership or internal policy revision. That documentation mattered, because it ensured the issue couldn't quietly resurface under new leadership or be reframed as unresolved. Residents who had once paid fines without question now understood that those payments had been made under a false premise, and that understanding carried an emotional weight that went beyond money, because it revealed how easily compliance can be extracted when authority goes unchallenged. The truck, still parked as it always had been, faded from focus entirely, no longer a point of contention or symbolism, just a vehicle on a public street, exactly where it belonged. Attention shifted instead to the broader implications of what the map represented, a clear boundary between what the HOA could regulate and what it could not, a boundary that had been blurred for years by confident language and habitual enforcement. The board's silence grew heavier, because silence now read as acknowledgement, and acknowledgement, even unspoken, changes how power is perceived. Neighbors no longer waited for permission to ask questions, because the map had answered the most important one already, and with that answer came a sense of stability that fear had never provided. The city's final notes emphasized that any future enforcement on the street would fall exclusively under municipal code, a statement that effectively ended the HOA's involvement without needing to dismantle it outright. That resolution felt both decisive and restrained, because it corrected the overreach without inflaming it, leaving the HOA intact but undeniably limited. The chapter closed with a strange calm settling over the neighborhood, not relief exactly, but clarity, the kind that arrives when uncertainty is replaced by fact. The map remained available, unchanged and unchanging, a quiet reminder that authority grounded in documentation outlasts authority grounded in assumption, and that once the difference between the two is made visible, it can never be unseen. After the map settled the question in ink and record, the neighborhood entered a phase that felt unfamiliar precisely because nothing dramatic happened. No new notices, no urgent emails, no sudden reversals announced with performative humility, just a slow, unmistakable quiet where tension used to live. The absence of enforcement wasn't temporary anymore, it was structural, embedded in the city's documentation and reinforced by the HOA's careful restraint. And that permanence changed how people moved through their days. Cars lined the street naturally, without strategic spacing or anxious glances. Routines resumed without the undercurrent of worry that had once accompanied even small deviations from perceived rules. The HOA's communications continued, but they were different now, stripped of the commanding tone that had once framed every reminder as an obligation rather than a suggestion. And even when they addressed unrelated matters, the language carried a noticeable caution, as if every sentence had learned the cost of certainty without proof. Residents noticed this shift not because it was announced, but because it altered expectations, and altered expectations reshape behavior more effectively than any policy ever could. Conversations that once revolved around enforcement now turned reflective, neighbors discussing how easily they had accepted authority simply because it presented itself confidently, how rarely anyone had asked for documentation, and how quickly fear had filled the gaps left by uncertainty. Those reflections didn't feel accusatory, they felt educational, the kind of understanding that arrives after a lesson has already been learned the hard way. The HOA, for its part, seemed to exist in a state of careful recalibration, continuing its administrative functions while avoiding any area that might invite renewed scrutiny, a strategy that preserved its existence but confirmed its diminished scope. Board members rotated, some quietly stepping down, others remaining but noticeably subdued, and that turnover happened without public conflict, because the community no longer needed confrontation to assert its position. The power dynamic had shifted not through replacement, but through clarification, and clarification tends to endure. Requests for refunds, once tentative, became more organized, not through outrage but through process, homeowners submitting documentation, referencing city conclusions, and receiving responses that were slow but no longer dismissive. Even where refunds were partial or delayed, the tone acknowledged legitimacy rather than defiance, a subtle but meaningful concession that the earlier stance could not be defended. The truck, now entirely unremarkable, blended back into the background of daily life, no longer a symbol of resistance, but evidence of normalcy restored, its presence no longer noticed because it no longer mattered. That ordinariness was perhaps the most profound outcome of all, because it marked the return of reality to a space that had been distorted by assumption for years. The city's involvement tapered off as well, not because interest waned, but because clarity had been achieved, and institutions built on record don't linger once their work is done. What remained was a neighborhood subtly transformed, more attentive, more informed, and less inclined to accept declarations without reference. That transformation didn't manifest as rebellion or distrust, but as engagement, residents reading documents they had once ignored, asking questions they had once avoided, and understanding the difference between governance and control in a way that felt empowering rather than confrontational. The HOA, now operating within clearly defined boundaries, became something closer to what it had likely always been intended to be, an administrative body rather than an authority unto itself, its influence contingent on cooperation rather than fear. That adjustment wasn't smooth or celebrated, but it was real, and real change rarely announces itself with ceremony. The quiet after the storm revealed something else as well, a collective recognition that the conflict had never truly been about parking or fines, but about the ease with which everyday power can expand when left unchecked, and the equal ease with which it contracts when documentation replaces assumption. That recognition lingered in small ways, in how meetings were conducted, how notices were worded, how decisions were explained, and those small ways mattered because they accumulated into culture. The neighborhood didn't become perfect or free of tension, but it became more honest, and honesty has a stabilizing effect that enforcement never achieves. As time passed, the story of the fines became something people referenced casually, not as a grievance, but as a reminder, a shared memory that reinforced why asking questions mattered. New residents heard it secondhand, often with disbelief, because the idea that an HOA could claim ownership of a public street sounded absurd once the truth was known, and that disbelief itself was proof that the lesson had taken hold. The chapter closed not with celebration, but with equilibrium, a balance restored through record and persistence rather than confrontation, leaving the final question not about what had been taken away from the HOA, but about what had been returned to the community, a sense of agency grounded not in defiance, but in understanding, setting the stage for the final chapter, where the long-term consequences of that understanding would come fully into view. The story didn't conclude with a dramatic ruling or a public apology, because most real endings don't arrive that way. They settle in gradually, shaping the future through the quiet certainty of what is now understood. The HOA continued to exist, but it existed differently, its role narrowed and clarified by a boundary that could no longer be blurred, a boundary drawn not by resistance, but by record. The street remained public, not because anyone had fought for it in a courtroom, but because it had always been that way, and once that fact was acknowledged, everything else adjusted around it. The fines that had once threatened financial strain became artifacts of a past mindset, referenced occasionally as reminders of how easily authority can drift when left unexamined. Some refunds arrived slowly, others partially, but even where money wasn't fully returned, something more enduring had been restored, a sense that rules now required justification rather than obedience. The neighborhood carried forward with that awareness embedded into its routines, residents more attentive to language, more curious about documentation, and more confident in asking where authority truly came from. Meetings became less performative and more procedural, decisions explained rather than declared, and even disagreements felt different because they were grounded in shared understanding rather than fear of consequence. The truck that had started everything faded completely into the landscape of daily life, its significance absorbed into normalcy, exactly where it belonged, no longer a marker of conflict, but a quiet testament to how small, ordinary moments can reveal large, structural truths. New board members approached their roles with caution and transparency, aware that confidence without proof had already failed once, and that awareness reshaped governance in ways no rule change ever could. The city's records remained unchanged, a permanent reference point that outlasted personalities and disputes, ensuring that the line between municipal authority and private administration would not be crossed again without immediate scrutiny. Neighbors who had once paid fines silently now spoke with ease about the difference between HOA guidelines and city law, not as activists, but as informed participants in their own community. That shift in knowledge proved more powerful than any confrontation, because it distributed authority evenly, removing the imbalance that had allowed overreach to flourish. The story became something people told not with anger, but with clarity, a shared example of why questions matter, why documentation matters, and why confidence should always be accompanied by proof. It wasn't a tale of rebellion or revenge, but of recalibration, of a system nudged back into alignment by persistence rather than force. The HOA learned, the community learned, and the lesson endured precisely because it wasn't imposed, it was discovered. Authority, once stripped of assumption, revealed its true boundaries, and those boundaries, clearly marked and widely understood, created a stability that fear never had. The final outcome wasn't the disappearance of the HOA, but the disappearance of its unchecked power, replaced by a structure that functioned within reality rather than above it. That distinction mattered, because it transformed compliance into cooperation and enforcement into explanation. The neighborhood moved forward with a quiet confidence rooted in understanding, not because conflict had been avoided, but because it had been resolved through truth. And in that resolution lay the most enduring conclusion of all. That authority ends where truth begins, and once that line is seen clearly, it remains visible long after the conflict that revealed it has faded into memory.